In this section, I would like to talk about how the balance is made. There are some ways and means to achieve the balancing power. First means, of course, or principle, is divide and rule, or conquer. And divide and rule policy is gaining power by breaking up larger concentration of power into pieces. If you break up the big powers into pieces, you might weaken their power. So this technique was used to give power the sovereign or king to control the subjects or his populations or factions of different interests. In order to control his subjects, kings used the tactics of divide and rule. Machiavelli, long time ago, already identified a similar application to military strategy. So a captain, according to Machiavelli, should divide the forces of the enemy. And the captain used some tactics to lie or give a wrong information to the captain of the enemy and make him suspicious of this man he trusted. So there were conflicts among the enemies, and then the captain could easily defeat the enemy. There's a tactic of divide and rule, obviously. So with a divide and rule, a king or sovereign, a sovereign breaks up the larger concentration of power into pieces. Second way to achieve balance of power is compensation. A compensation in the history of diplomacy was a useful means to reach an agreement, particularly to end conflicts, such as war or direct confrontations. Compensation. Usually the weaker party pays the compensation to the stronger in order to stop for the damage or in order to stop war, something like that. So it includes a part of territory. You can give up a part of territory, or money, or tributes, or people. During the Mongol dynasty, the Koryo dynasty of Korea used to send hundreds, normally 200 or 300 women to Mongol dynasty every year for decades. That's it's a sad history, but it's an example of compensation. Or territory too, or send soldiers or tributes to the great empires. So compensation was a useful means to reach an agreement for the weaker side. But the stronger side does not pay compensation. Now, armament and disarmament. Armament means the process of increasing the number and strength of countries' weapons. Increasing. So it's easy to have armament if you have enough money, and also if you have people's consent in democratic societies. But unlike armament, disarmament is very contradictory and problematic. Disarmament is the act of reducing or limiting or abolishing weapons. Obviously, it takes a lot of money to build weapons. But think about the country's position, which it has to disarm or reduce, limit the weapons already it paid a lot of money for. And disarmament generally means a country's military or specific type of weaponry. Disarmament. A specific weapons, or the size of military, or size of defense or the budget. So sometimes disarmament is taken to mean total elimination of weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction means WMD, including the nuclear weapons or thermonuclear weapons, such as nuclear arms defined by the UN General Assembly. Disarmament must be done by the resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly. That's the rule of international affairs. When you disarm, when you ask disarm to a certain country, you must go with the principle made by the United Nations General Assembly. Disarmament. Examples, the current North Korean nuclear negotiations. International society, including the United States and Japan and South Korea, are demanding North Korea to dismantle, abolishing nuclear capabilities. And North Korea does not take the recommendation, and then the UN gives sanctions, economic sanctions against North Korea. Of course, by individual sanctions by the United States and Japan too, and South Korea also. But each individual country's sanction against North Korea must be carried out by the principles of United Nations. And the former SALT between the US and Soviet Union, the strategic arms limitation talks. In 1960s and 70s, 80s, US and the Soviet Union respectively had more than 10,000 nuclear warheads. With those countries could destroy the world more than 200 times. So they had more than enough nuclear warheads. So they started to reduce numbers of nuclear warheads in their agreements, the SALT agreement, strategic arms limitation talks. So they voluntarily reduced numbers of warheads, nuclear warheads. Now, intervention or non-intervention. So balance of power system can be made in terms of by the means of intervention or non-intervention. And both concepts, intervention or non-intervention, are quite the controversial issues too. First, intervention is defined as interference in the territory or domestic affairs of another state with military force. You intervene into some other country's affairs with the military force. Can you believe it? What if your country is intervened, some other country interfere your country's territory or domestic affairs? A sovereign country's government's control over its own affairs against the sovereignty. So intervention has always been a controversial subject for a long, long time. Whenever there's a conflict in the world, outside countries, whether outside countries intervene or not, and with what authority? Who provided that authority to those countries to intervene other countries? And non-intervention, in contrast, is a doctrine that opposes interference in the domestic politics and affairs of other countries without consent. It is a 1915 definition by President Roosevelt. But sometimes in world affairs, we see the many times of the great powers intervention or non-intervention into regional conflicts. So it is hard to decide which maneuver, which strategy should be used, intervention or non-intervention into in order to solve the problem or establish a balance of power. Let me introduce one example of intervention in the history of East Asia. 1895 was the end of Sino-Japanese Treaty. So surprisingly, Japan had a war with the Qing dynasty and had a victory over the Qing dynasty. So world population was shocked. Obviously, the defeat of the Sino-Japanese War, China became a paper tiger. But after the victory of the Sino-Japanese War in 1985, Japan leased the eastern part of China, the Liaodong province. Japan leased it. Those days, 3 countries of Europe, Russia, Germany, and France, were watching the Chinese politics very carefully, but they did not like the idea of the Japanese owning of the Liaodong Peninsula. So those 3 countries intervened into the Japanese occupation of Liaodong and exerted pressure. And finally, Japan gave up that Liaodong province. That's the example of East Asia of intervention. Alliance is an effective tool to make a balance of power. Alliance is a formal agreement between the 2 or more states for mutual support in case of war. Between 2 or more states, countries, for mutual support in case of war. So contemporary alliances provide for combined action on the part of 2 or more independent states. And generally, contemporary alliances are defensive in nature. These days, countries do not make an alliance for attack. Obligating allies to join forces if one or more of them is attacked by another party or another parties or coalition. Good example is the current ROK-US alliance and US-Japanese alliance, US-German alliance, and US-Saudi Arabian alliance. These alliances are defensive in nature, and they act together in case of any attack by a third party. Obviously, alliance is a prominent means to achieve balance of power. Make a buffer zone. Buffer zone is a neutral area lies between 2 or more bodies of land. Depending on type, it serves to separate regions or conjoin regions. Separate the part or conjoin the part. And common types are demilitarized zones, border zones, and certain restrictive easement zones or green belts. So they have many different purposes: prevent violence, or protect environment, or shield residential and commercial zones from industrial accidents or natural disasters. Examples: the DMZ currently in Korea. Also in Cyprus. Have you seen it's in the map of Cyprus? There's a DMZ in Cyprus between the 2 areas. One influenced by Turkey, the other one by Greece. and currently the Wakhan corridor between Tajikistan and Pakistan. These are the buffer zone in Korea or in Cyprus or Tajikistan and Pakistan in order to prevent the close contacts and conflicts. Also, during the World War I and World War II, the Poland was a buffer zone between Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, in order to make a balance of power, there are two kinds of conditions. First, powers must be decentralized. As we have seen in 19th century Europe, the UK was the first among many in Europe. So power was not concentrated to the UK. Second assumption, second condition is that there should be no fixed enemy. Enemies and make alliance should be flexible. Today's enemy could be tomorrow's friend. So Great Britain had no eternal enemies, nor eternal friends. So it was very flexible to make or destroy alliances in the 18th and 19th century Europe.